and welcome to today's live IELTS class. My name is Adrian, and I'm streaming to you from beautiful Budapest in the Carpathian Basin. I hope everybody has had a good week and looking forward to a great weekend. This is a members chat class. Of course, everybody is welcome to watch, and this class is focusing on IELTS Task 1 writing. This is for the academic IELTS exam. For general IELTS students, your Task 1 is quite different. You have to write a letter or an email. For academic students, they have to write about a graph, chart, diagram, flow chart. So it is quite different. So this is more for academic students. To become a member of our channel, you can click the join button beside the subscribe button. And these lessons, of course, are presented to you by AEHelp. Academic IELTS Success. Visit us there. And for the general IELTS, check us out at gieltshelp.com. That's generalieltshelp.com. We have some of the best materials online in the world, and we help to prepare thousands of students every day to pass their exams, improve their communication and their English. Hi, Beck John. Hi, Jainil. Hi, Abhishek. Nice to see our members coming into the class. For everyone, just a quick peek here. This is the academic web portal with the blue background. You can click that big red button to join the premium package. If you have questions, just click that little help button there to interact with us. And for the general IELTS, it's the green background here, and you can click that big red button to join the premium package and get access to over 100 hours of video lessons, original practice exams, and a fully interactive course. If you have questions about our products or about the exam, just send me an email, adrian@aehelp.com. And of course, we have apps for your mobile, so you can download the app Academic IELTS Help, link it to aehelp.com, or download General IELTS Help and link it to gieltshelp.com. Welcome, Preeti, Ferdavs, Jaswinder. Nice to see more of you coming into the class. That's fantastic. So today, task 1, and then we will do part 3 and part 4 listening after this class. Everybody will be able to join in on that chat. Of course, that's in about 90 minutes, and that's a continuation from yesterday's part 1, part 2 speaking. And then tomorrow we'll have, listening. Tomorrow we'll have speaking. So tomorrow we'll have speaking part 2 and part 3 for members and for everyone at this time. Okay, so make sure you're there for that speaking practice. And we'll get right into our task 1 sent to me by one of our regular students. And they said, hey, here's a kind of a question that I was looking at. And I was wondering if you could do a class on this just to see how to think about this bar graph and develop a good high band 9 response. So first thing is first, as the saying goes. Let's read the question carefully. IELTS Task 1 writing. You should spend about 20 minutes on this task. Spend 20 minutes on the task. Don't spend any more. Don't take time from task 2. Always start with task 1. Task 1 is worth 1/3 of your mark. It's an expository essay, which means that you have to explain what you see. In theory, it should be easier than task 2 because all of the information is given. You don't have to come up with original ideas. So as long as you know what you're doing, you're golden. Okay? All right. Here we go. So let's read this. The graph shows the percentage of males in a particular country who prefer watching sports to males who prefer participating in sports. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Okay, so some country, something about sports, whether these men like to watch or like to play in a specific sport. Now here, keep in mind, students, it says write at least 150 words. Okay, 150 words that that's the minimum. So if you write less than 150 words, you will start to lose marks. Okay? You have enough space and time to write about 200 good, high quality words, making a good essay. So your aim for the students who need or want those high bands like band 8, band 9, you should be aiming for about 200 words, okay, in that time. All right, so here we go with our bar graph. Can everybody see this bar graph clearly enough? I know it's not the highest resolution, but I'm hoping that it's clear enough. Maybe I'll walk you through it a little bit. Pwiti, in general version, you don't get graphs and bars. You get a letter. You have to write a letter to someone, like a boss or a friend. So it's letter writing. It's different. That's a narrative piece, Pwiti, not this. For that one, check out GLShelp.com. Okay. All right, Begjan says it's good. I can see it. Great. Thanks, Begjan, for letting me know. So just to clear, the first bar in each one, that's the watching, okay? And then the darker bar, it's got a little bit of a different pattern. It's a diagonal pattern rather than the box pattern. So the second bar for each sport is the participation, okay? All right. And then we have the sports. We have football, rugby, basketball, badminton, fishing, and horse riding and racing. Okay? All right, so those are the different sports. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different sports. Okay? All right, so far so good. Now we need to begin by putting together our overview. Now, to put together the overview, we start by paraphrasing, of course. We're going to move along here nice and smooth today, students. This isn't an overly complex bar graph. So we're going to go through this nice and smooth and really just get it done, okay? So first step is paraphrase the question with more detail. So go ahead and paraphrase this question with more detail. I'll toggle back to the bar graph in just a moment so you can get some more of those details. Maybe I'll give you some information here so you can put it together. Okay, so to give more details, you should use the word bar. You should probably use the words 6 sports. Okay, and for the sports, you have football, rugby, basketball. I would guess this is probably for Australia just by the sports, but who knows? Okay, badminton, fishing, and horse riding. All right? So that's some of the vocabulary that you should use to paraphrase the question with more details to show your understanding of the question. Okay? All right, Bekjan says the given vertical bar graph illustrates the proportion of men who opt for either watching or participating in 6 types of sports in a specific nation. Okay, Bekjan, it's good. All right. I would probably list the sports here. 6 is just enough that it can fit there so we're clear on all of the sports that we're discussing. So I would probably list the sports, okay? And I do see your correction there for the 7, so that's fine. Vertical bar chart is okay. The other way we call this type of bar chart, Bekjan, is a column bar chart, okay? So this column bar graph, I call these graphs chart. It's interesting. Chart is kind of I know the British like to use the word chart. and I think the Australians and Kiwis also use chart. Canadians and Americans tend to use graph more. We both use both, I think, but in North America, in the US, and Canada, we tend to refer to these more as graphs. I like to call them graphs. I'm Canadian, but if you call it a chart, that's fine. So this column bar graph depicts. Always paraphrase the word shows. It's just so easy to paraphrase that. There's so many ways to say that. Okay, so depicts the percentage of men in a certain nation who choose to either watch certain sports or play them, namely football, rugby, basketball, badminton, fishing, and horse riding. Okay. All right. So that would be my detailed paraphrase of the question. Okay. This is where the examiner sees that, okay, this student is not just simply paraphrasing the question, but they're adding details using the graph. So they're already starting their interpretation, their expose of this expository essay. They're going into details. Okay. So this is part of your overview / introduction. Your overview and introduction is the same thing. You don't need to separate them. If you really want to, fine. I think it's awkward. I think if you separate your overview in a university class dealing with the graph or chart, the professor might say, why did you do that? It's just your introduction. It's weird to separate that into 2 paragraphs. I see that on the IELTS. This is sometimes recommended by some courses. I don't think it's necessary, and I know that you will not lose marks for separating it. The problem with separating the introduction from the overview, in my opinion, is that you're actually using space, especially if you're writing in the paper-based exam. Okay, so that's one of the kind of logical reasons, especially for high-level students who can write quickly and can write more than 150 words. Okay, so keep this in mind. I haven't mentioned this in past classes, members, but if you are taking the paper based IELTS exam, your writing space is limited, so you want to maximize your use of space. Therefore, you should not separate the introduction from the overview, because this is not necessary. Also, you should not separate paragraphs with lines, but instead you should indent. Okay, is everybody clear on that? So save your space. Okay, there is no specific rule that you have to separate paragraphs with spaces. You can absolutely separate a paragraph with just an indent. It means moving the first word of the next paragraph 5 spaces in. That is technical writing in English. Okay, you should not separate your introduction and your overview, because you're wasting space when you have limited space in your answer booklet for your writing section. Okay, is everybody clear on that? If you do a practice exam at home, you will see this. Okay, so if you make use of as much space as possible for task 1, task 2, especially for those of you who are fast writers and can write to the limit or to the maximum space available, then make sure you pay attention to that. Okay. Yeah, OS. So your paraphrase is the start of your overview, so it definitely counts as part of your 150 words. Okay, all right. Janelle, there is no specific number of points that you have to include in the key features. It really depends on what the graph is that you're looking at. So that graph might have just one key feature, or it might have several. Okay. I probably wouldn't include more than a few, one or two at most. Okay. All right. Ferdov says the given bar graph depicts the comparison of men who watch 6 types of sports events or play them in percentage in a certain government. Ferdov's one really important correction is or instead of and. Okay, that's very confusing. And is not correct. Okay, it's very incorrect in this context. All right. Okay, so be careful with that and. All right, everyone. So that is the start of our overview. So here's my beginning of this overview. Let's pop this down here. Okay. Just give me a second. So overview. Let's correct that. Overview. All right. And then here we go. So this is how it starts. This column bar graph depicts the percentage of men. Let's correct that. In a certain nation who choose to either watch certain sports or play them, namely football, rugby, basketball, badminton, fishing, and horse riding. Notice I didn't say horse racing because I think that makes sense. It doesn't have to be separate like in the graph. Then we look for the main feature, okay? So now what we're looking for, kind of main feature here that really just jumps out at you when you look at this graph. So there's definitely one point that really clearly pops out at me when I'm looking at this graph, and hopefully some of you will get the same idea here. Again, this is fairly simple. Thankfully, this is not an overly complex graph. If you get something like this in your academic IELTS, consider yourselves lucky. It's a good one. Okay? It should be fairly simple. Okay? So Beckjohn, yeah, absolutely. That's what I got to. So Beckjohn says, at first glance, it's evident that males choose to take part in most sports rather than watch them, with the exception of fishing. So Beckjum, you have to be a little bit cautious with the wording here. Remember that your reader is an alien. They might not be looking at the graph. So finish the idea, okay? At first glance, it is evident that males choose to take part in most sports rather than watch them, with the exception of fishing. That's more clarity, okay? Especially because it's still just at the very beginning of your essay, so you want a lot of clarity here, all right? You want to complete that comparison, okay? Even though it seems intrinsic, Beckjun, you'd want to state that in a report, in an expository report, okay? So what Beckjun's talking about, different ways to say that, but he's right. Notice how for all 6 of these, except for horse riding, okay, Beckjun, it's not fishing, it's horse riding. Beckjun, you're right. Fishing. If we look at all of these, then we can see that with all of these sports, except for fishing, the bar for watching and for participating is different, okay? So watching is low here, but it's much higher for participating in fishing. All of these other ones, watching is the highest, okay? So, Beckjun, just maybe you didn't see this here clearly, okay? Again, or maybe I confused you at the beginning and explained this wrong. So this is watching. This is participating. I think maybe the graph's a little bit unclear, so I'm just showing you that again, okay? So bar is watching, second one is participating. So more people watch football, participate in football. People watch rugby than participate in rugby. Okay, so this is Watching, participating, watching, participating. Sorry if I was a little bit confusing there. Okay. All right. So maybe rewrite that, Bekjan, so that it makes sense. Okay. So second column is participating or taking part or actually playing or doing the sport. The first one is watching it, maybe live or on television. Who knows? That's not given, that detail. But it definitely means being the audience instead of taking part. When you have this kind of watching, participating, what you want to think of as well is, or are other words that you can use, like audience. Okay. Participants, take part. Play. Okay, or do. All right. So you want to think about these other words that will be useful for you so you're not just repeating yourself. Okay. All right. So yeah, that's the most observable. Okay. In all cases, the watching bars are higher than the participating except for fishing, which makes sense, right? Most of these graphs are kind of like real life. So I think that most people would rather go fishing than watch fishing on TV. Okay, most people for sure. I know I would. And then with these other ones, it's kind of agreeable as well. So that's the main feature. Okay, so immediately it can be noted that of the 6 sports, more men like to be observers than participants, with the exception of fishing. Okay, so absolutely, yeah. Okay, and now I see some other people coming up with their ideas as well. Ois says the percentage of watching is more than participation. Ois, I agree. And also the graph disparity, the rate of participation in different sports. Yeah, Ois, but I think that's going to be true for nearly any graph, so it's a bit awkward to state that. Okay, it's too general. You want to use information, Ois, that's more specific to the graph. And I think it's more specific to state this as the main feature. Okay. So Abhishek says, at first glance, it is apparent that seeing sport games, watching, seeing is a bit awkward, Abhishek. So, or observing. Another synonym for watching is observing. Seeing is not quite the same because seeing is passive. Watching and observing are active. Okay, did everybody catch that? That's an important difference between the word seeing and watching and observing. Seeing is passive. I can passively see information from the corner of my eyes. But when I'm watching the screen or observing the screen, I'm actively looking at it. I'm processing the information. So keep that in mind. Okay, it's like the difference between hearing and listening. Hearing, something that we do passively. Listening, it's something that we do actively. All right, so careful with that. Okay. All right, so Abhishek says, at first glance, it is apparent that observing sport games are more popular for men, except for fishing, which has more members than other sports. Okay, Abhishek, careful. It's a bit of an awkward one, all right, especially with seeing and members. So careful with your vocabulary choice. Bekjan says, at first glance, it is evident that most males choose to be an audience rather than taking part in sports, with the exception of fishing. Very good, Bekjan. Nice correction. Okay, Jaswinder says immediately, fishermen are higher than others. Fishermen are higher than others. However, the audience of football and horse riding are at the top. Jaswinder, that's confusing, and it's too much detail for a main feature. And it's not quite accurate. So you have to really clearly separate, Jaswinder, here, the concept of being the audience versus participation. Don't try to say too much too quickly, Jaswinder. So separate it into clear ideas. Okay. Dr. Krishna says, at first glance, it is clear, or sorry, one more time, Dr. Krishna. At first glance, it is evident that the majority of men prefer to be audience rather than playing the game, except fishing. Yeah, that works, Dr. Krishna. That's good. All right. Okay, so now we want to go through the bar graph and kind of identify our points of comparison. Now, of course, we started by saying that all of these, the men like to watch more than play, except fishing. So it makes sense to, of course, make this comparison first. So this first point here. What would be your second point? So after, in the analysis, on the body paragraph, after going into more detail and explaining this piece of data or datum, what would be the next one? What would you think it makes sense to be number two, your second sentence or your second analysis? What makes sense here? So it says, why wouldn't we talk about football second? Because then fishing. Okay, and Jainil agrees. Okay, Abhishek, good football. Yeah, because here, if we look at football and we look at fishing, there's a very clear contrast. What word or what vocabulary comes into mind when we compare these two sports or the data on these two sports? What word comes to mind? So what will be a nice connective word? Conversely is good. There's another word, Baekjun, that starts with an I, and it sounds very similar to conversely. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Abhishek, Dr. Krishna, Ois? So instead of conversely, I would actually use a piece of vocabulary here that's more specific to this comparison. What would that be? It also ends with sli. It actually ends with ersely. Yeah, for Dobbs, very nice. So not invert, but you're very, very close. Inversely. Okay? So you're very close for Dobbs. You have a different word form. Okay? Inversely. Okay, it's the inverse. Okay? It's inverted or it's the inverse of it, right? So it's like the flipped of it. So it's inversely. Conversely or inversely. Okay. All right. Good. So there we have number one, number two. What would be number three? So what would you take as number three? Okay. So we have number one, we have number two. What makes sense as number three? Hopefully we're all thinking similarly here, because I think number three is kind of an obvious. Yeah, Baekjun, I would agree. Horse riding. So I would take that as number three. Why? Because it's similar to football, right? We have good flow here. Number one, it's unique. Number two, it's the inverse. Number three, it's similar to number two. And then what would be number four? Yeah, Baekjun, we would definitely use similarly there. What would make sense as number four? Hopefully everybody's kind of thinking the same thing for the fourth piece. Yeah, absolutely, Abhishek. Number four would be basketball because it's a little bit higher. And then number five, we combine, right? So hopefully everybody sees that we could combine analysis, because rugby and badminton are quite similar in their proportion of viewers or audience versus players or participants, with a little bit more participation in badminton than rugby, right? So yeah, so Ois, careful, basketball is a little bit more than these other two, but definitely badminton and rugby are quite synonymous. Okay, quite synonymous. All right. So Now, of course, keep in mind the percentages here. Okay, 0, 12.5, 25, 37.5, and 50. And that makes sense, right? Because all men together would be 100. All right. So a man is the audience. There can be both. So it makes sense that the y-axis goes only to 50, and it's divided in these ways. All right. So let's do this. Let's get into the analysis, okay? So let's now choose our vocabulary, pay attention to our grammar, and then give the analysis for each of these points, starting with number 1, which is going into more detail about fishing, okay? Fishing, all right? So fishing. So fishing is right at 50%, and for participants and for audience, it's just over 12.5%. Okay, all right. So 50, a little bit over 12.5. Careful here, students, not to use too many numbers, okay, like 13.75%. So careful not to use too many numbers. Okay. Yeah, just wonder if it makes sense to mention the x and the y-axis. It's okay to say that. I saw that some students said, "Oh, my teacher said don't talk about the x and the y-axis." I don't agree. I think in some cases it absolutely makes sense to include what the x and y-axis scales are. Okay, it makes it a lot clearer for your audience. So in this case, I don't know if it's absolutely necessary. Okay, I wouldn't mention the x and y in this particular case, but especially with line graphs, just when with line graphs, it's often very sensible to mention what the x and y axes are because they're your dependent variables and it's continuous. So with a line graph, just wonder, often yes. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start writing here, and you start writing, and then we'll compare. Okay. So analyses. All right. So that's my first point. All right. Oh, it says it's clear that the highest rate of participation in fishing reaches to 50%. Okay, it's not bad, OS. 50% is half of the men, right? Beckjan says, when looking at the data in more detail, it's evident that fishing is the only sport where there are half of the males who prefer to partake, whereas just over 12.5% do the opposite. Yeah, and Beckjan, always use the symbol for percent. Don't actually write percent. It's one word. It's not percent. It's percent, one word. And use the symbol, then you won't make a spelling mistake, okay? Ferdov says, analyzing dipper. Ferdov's not analyzing dipper. It's analyzing deeper, okay? Deeper, D-E-E-P, okay? Deeper, D-E-E-P-E-R. Okay. All right. Okay, so this is what I have so far. So looking at each of these sports in more detail, half of all men in this country prefer to be active fishermen, while just over a tenth choose to be audience. Okay, so notice that what I've done here is I took those numbers and I turned it into interpretation. Okay, so I'm interpreting. Your goal is to interpret. That's what will get you those high band scores. Okay. Abhishek says, looking into more detail, fishing activity is the highest for participants that almost touch half of all men, while the audience are slightly above 12.5%. Okay, it's very specific, Abhishek. Touch the half of men is kind of weird. It's kind of funny too. So participate, which is almost half of all men. It's not almost, Abhishek. It actually is. Okay, so participate, which is half of all men. Okay, so the graph here, the top here, maybe you're confused by this extra line at the top, but the 50% mark is right here, and that actually touches the 50% mark. So it is half of all men. Okay. Okay, now football is the next. Keep writing, students. If you fall behind a little bit, if you're still working on fishing and I'm working on football, don't worry about it. I'll catch what you're writing, okay? So I can maneuver around. Just keep going. I'm just moving forward, okay? So I'm going to go to football here. Inversely, football is watched by nearly half of all men, while a tenth prefer playing on the pitch. Okay. So here, I'm looking at football and I'm making that second comparison, right? That inversely, okay? Inversely, so it's the exact flip, okay? Proportional flip. Janil says, after deeper inspection, it is notable that fishing, riding, and racing is watched half of the men, while just over 1/4 of men. Janil, you have to rethink that. That's very confusing. Take a look at this. So, fishing, the participants are half. The watchers are just over a tenth. They're 13%. Okay? If we think about 100%, it's a tenth. All right? Horse riding is quite different here. All right? It's quite a different piece of data. So again, I think the difficulty here is that you're including too much information into, or trying to include too much information into one sentence. Separate it out a little bit more carefully. Okay? All right. Ferdov says, inversely, soccer is observed a bit less than 50%, while only 12% of males are keen on watching this sport. You mean playing, Ferdovs. Careful with your information. Okay. Dr. Krishna says, on the contrary, football audience is almost 50% of men, while only 10% preferred to partake in the match. Dr. Krishna, don't use past tense preferred, use present tense. This is a point that a lot of students ask me is, should I use present tense or past tense? We don't see any dates here. So this just says, generally, this is the trend in some country. Okay, so this is not a very specific graph in the sense that we don't know the country. I'm guessing Australia, but we don't actually know the country, so you can't include information. And also, it doesn't give us the year. So there is no 2002, 2010. When there's no year included, you have to stay present tense, okay, with your verbs. So pay attention to what year the information is. If there's no year given, then it's present tense. That's an important note. Okay. Oh, it says, regarding football, sports is the highest audience among other sports, unlike the participation in this sport, lowest among the 6 sports. In comparison, OS, yes, within the sport, right? We don't know the actual numbers. So here's another important tip, OS and other viewers, for academic purposes. Be very careful about this. This is percent. We don't know the actual numbers. And the numbers would actually be very different if we saw these. So for football, it could be as high as 100,000 men. And this would be maybe like, I don't know, let's say in comparison, 20,000 men. Okay. But you might have something like horse riding, and this might be something like 2,000 men, and this one here would be like 800 men. Okay. So even though the graphs seem to be the same height, these are percentages, they're not numbers. So always you have to be very careful to change the concept of percentage into actual amounts or numbers of men. Okay? Do you see how that information can be misinterpreted if you say highest or lowest? You have to say percent, or you have to say half of, because it's proportional. So you have to be really careful, right? I know that you might not have intended to mean that. You might be like, look, of course I realize that, but that's, you choose your words in that way, it can be misinterpreted. Okay? So careful with that, all right? It's percents, keep that in mind. Okay, so you have to write accordingly. You have to write very clearly in that. All right, so let's keep going here. So that was 1 and 2. Now we'll go to horse riding, okay? So horse riding. Relatively comparable proportion of viewers and doers. About 47%. And, well, maybe it's a little bit more doers here, but anyway. And 19% respectively. Yeah, somebody might call me out on that and say, hey, and I think that there are quite a few more actual doers than with football, but you know what? IELTS, they're not going to be picky about that. If you do it like I did, I guarantee you'll be just fine. Okay? Okay. All right. Yeah, don't worry about it, Janil. That happens, okay? Just make sure that in the actual exam you keep it really, really clear, okay? Dr. Krishna says, horse riding presents quite similar rates to football as viewers and players, around 47 and 19% respectively. Good. Firdaus says, like football, not likely, Firdaus, but like football, more men love to watch horse riding and racing. About 46% were twice as less males like to do it. We don't play horseback riding, so be careful with your verbs here. We play football, we do horseback riding. Okay, so these are a bit tricky, I know, but do pay attention to this detail of doing versus playing. Okay, you play tennis, you do horseback riding, or you do swimming, for example. You don't play swimming, you do swimming. I know English can be tough sometimes. It's one example. Beckjan says, similarly, there is an approximate 40% of men who are eager to be observers in horse riding, and riders compose just under a fourth. Yeah, riders, very nice, Beckjan. Yeah, they are. They're horseback riders, so that's a good way to do it. Okay, so now we're moving on to basketball. All right. So, okay. So notice how I haven't used percentages all the way until here. So my writing isn't filled with percentages, but it focuses more on interpreting the data. That's really, really important. Okay. So now for basketball, so in regards to basketball, the proportion of viewers and players is more balanced, about 37 to 25% respectively. And it's not about, it's exact here. Okay. And then the next one here is rugby and badminton, which show very similar trends at about 30% viewership and approximately, let's say, 18, 19% participants. Okay, so that's for rugby and for badminton. Finally, rugby and badminton show similar trends of preference. With viewers at 30%, participants at 20%, say. Just put in the word roughly because they do differ a little bit. So roughly 20%. Okay, and I know everybody's still writing, and that's fantastic. Okay, I'm sure you're doing a good job. I want to get to the summary. So that's why I kind of completed this here, because I want to get to the summary. Okay, and it is good to include a summary, especially for those of you seeking those high band scores. Okay, it's an expository essay. Expository essays will commonly include a summary. And in your expository essays and presentations like this about graphs and charts, you are expected in most cases by your professors and teachers to include a summary. Okay, so you can start it with in summary, and then you want to state some point that that's interesting, that we learned from this graph that we haven't really said in the overview, and that we can understand from all of the analysis that we've done. So by analyzing all of this data in our second main graph, what can we summarize about this? Okay, so what can we summarize about the men in this country and their preference in the world of sports? Okay, so this is kind of what I wanted to get to here. This is why I moved through the last couple of analyses a little bit more quickly, because I wanted to ask you this question for the summary of what can we summarize here. Okay, and if you're stuck, just read what you've written so far, and perhaps the summary will really come to mind. Okay, So this column bar graph depicts the percentage of men in a certain nation who choose to either watch certain sports or play them, namely football, rugby, basketball, badminton, fishing, and horse riding. Immediately, it can be noted that of 6 sports, more men like to be observers than participants, with the exception of fishing. Looking at each of these sports in more detail, half of all men in this country prefer to be active fishermen, while just over a tenth choose to be audience. Inversely, football is watched by nearly half of all men, while a tenth prefers playing on the pitch. Horse racing was relatively comparable proportion of viewers and doers, about 47% and 19% respectively. In regards to basketball, the proportion of viewers and players is more balanced, 37.5 to 25% respectively. Finally, rugby and badminton show similar trends of preference, with viewers at 30% and participants at roughly 20%. In summary, and what can we say in summary? Okay, so what can we say in summary? If you haven't finished, that's fine. Give me your summary. What can we summarize about this? This is what I would write. Think about it. Don't look at what I'm writing until the end. Okay. Yeah, very nice, Back John. So you wrote that before I finished mine, so I know that's your original thought, and that's great. So in summary, there's a significant difference between players and viewers in these athletics. Okay, in these athletics, not in some athletes, Back John, but it makes sense to write in these athletics. Okay, instead of sports, athletics. Dr. Krishna says, to sum it up, the majority of men prefer to be observers, but fishing is an exception. Dr. Krishna, that would be okay, but you've already said that in your overview. Okay, so if you write only that in your summary, Dr. Krishna, then you're really just repeating your overview and you haven't done anything original, so you might as well just leave it and then go to task 2, right? So make sure, Dr. Krishna, that your summary is a bit more than just a repeat of your main feature in the overview. That's one of the most common mistakes that students make in their summary, is they just paraphrase or repeat the key feature, the main feature of the overview. Okay. Oh, it says the audience rate of all sports are more than players, especially football and fishing. Or the last one, I forget which one. Oh, it's okay, not bad. Simplify that, OS. So you're on the right track, OS, but you want to simplify it. There's significant difference depending on the sport. And that's kind of what I've written here. So in summary, although men more commonly prefer to be the audience in these sports, with the exception of fishing, the proportion of participants to viewers varies significantly depending on the sport. So that's what we can summarize about this, right? Is that when we look at the graph, you have sports where there's loads of viewers and very few participants. And then you have sports where, hey, look, the participants and the viewers are almost the same. So there's quite a bit of variance depending on the sport. Okay, that would be your summary. All right. Okay, everyone, I will post this. I will put up the full essay with the graph into our YouTube community thread, into the post, so you'll see it there later on in the next few days. Thank you so much. I hope everybody picked up a few gems from this class that you can apply to your academic IELTS task 1 and also your academic studies when you're in school and you're doing engineering, chemistry, biology, medicine, and you're looking at these graphs and charts, how to better express yourself. Again, focus on interpretation. Don't just describe the numbers that you see, but interpret them. Okay. All right, everyone, coming up in about 30 minutes. Listening, parts 3 and 4 practice with some strategy. Janeel, I'm not sure what you're referring to. Send me an email if I didn't catch something there. You're very welcome, OS. Beautiful participation. I love it when our newer members really engage these classes. You get a lot of value out of it, OS, so keep it up. Hopefully I'll see everybody soon. Remember, check us out at aehelp.com for academic IELTS. Check out the premium package. It's worth the investment. gieltshelp.com for general IELTS. And see you in half an hour. I'm Adrian, signing out for now from Budapest. Bye.